Welcome to Council Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Council Culture with myself, Olivia Adam, and Michael Evans also joins me. Hello, Michael. How are you?
Hey, Olivia. Yeah, good to be back on the podcast. Been away for a few weeks. It's nice to be back and for it to be sunny and warm. Looking forward to it today.
Yeah, likewise. I had a week off last week and obviously missing the action in the legal world. I think there's only one place that we could really start, which is an overview of what is going on with Trump at the moment. Obviously there's so much that's still going on in this space. It's kind of maybe gaining less traction than it was originally, but there's still so much to talk about. So, Michael, what are your opinions?
Well, obviously it's difficult not to have thoughts. I think the lawyers sort of Trump tracker, so to speak, in their rolling updates on Trump v. Big Law is always a good way to catch up. So if anybody isn't aware of that and wants to keep up to date, I commend it to them. I think, some of the recent last few days, what we've seen, there was a Goodwin partner who formed a group called, I think, Law Firm Partners United, which put out which is partners in AmLaw 200 firms acting in their own personal capacity, so not associated with their firms. And they've put in an amicus brief in support of firms targeted by Trump executive orders. And I think what's quite interesting is seeing partners at firms who've signed that. Some of whom have put their names publicly to it. Some of whom remained anonymous, but some of the ones who did put their name to it, making quite heartfelt LinkedIn posts about not missing their shot, about why it's important to stand up for the rule of law, and why they felt compelled to sign up to this amicus brief. That's been, I think, heartening to see from a kind of rule of law perspective, and an interesting development, and probably a public service. The Goodwin partner, Neil Chatterjee, I think his name is, who formed that group. That's been one notable development. I think General Block has been back in court. It seems to be getting a sympathetic hearing, but no rulings yet. I think the latest executive order from Trump, where it's been, I think, strengthening and unleashing America's law enforcement to pursue criminals and protect innocent citizens, contains a clause where they're talking about creating a mechanism to provide legal resources to law enforcement officers who incur expenses and liabilities through the course of discharging their duties. This mechanism shall include the use of private sector pro bono assistance for such law enforcement officers. There seems to be some speculation that's referencing the pro bono deals that some firms cut with the Trump administration, with the White House, in return for the executive orders against them being dropped, and resolving any issues with the EEOC over DEI policies.
Is this quite a concerning situation? At first glance, it seems to be the intersection between law and the police, and Trump having a hand in both of them and instructing lawyers to defend police. It seems it doesn't seem great to me.
Well, I don't think anybody would really look at any of this.
No, that's very true. Yeah.
Kind of coercion, and think, completely unconcerned about any of this. I don't think anybody who, I think I've worked in and around the legal sector for more than, quite a bit more than 20 years now. crap. Nearly 25
Exclusive.
years.
Yeah.
Jesus. Okay, I was happier when I could say 20 years, but I'm coming up on a quarter of a century. And although I'm not a lawyer, I've always, I really remember. I really remember when I was at Euromoney in the early 2000s. Writing articles about the link between the link between economic growth and the rule of law, and how everything works better when you have got strong commitments to the rule of law. And I don't think I was and I kind of got really into it. And I remember reading around it and interviewing people, doing some stuff for the IBA as well as some stuff for Euromoney around this, and speaking to people in jurisdictions where there weren't strong commitments, or where those commitments had been eroded over time, and speaking to I remember interviewing a judge in Zimbabwe, and how the sort of corrosion and erosion of rule of law, the impact, the real world impacts, not just on the economy, on people, and that always kind of stuck with me. So it's just seeing some of the stuff that's been going on in the US in terms of very deliberate attempts to undermine the rule of law. I think, of course, it is really concerning. And I think anybody, as I said, who works in and around the legal sector, even if they're not lawyers themselves, they may be buyers of legal services indirectly or directly, or suppliers to the legal sector like ourselves. And of course it's concerning. And I just, there was a very interesting note that a Harvard professor disseminated before Harvard had been targeted, about why advising, although this professor was sort of head of the Harvard School of Negotiation, and gave advice saying, I don't usually say this, but my advice is do not negotiate, because you are not negotiating the deals you think you are. This is purely a power play, and it's like trying to negotiate terms with a playground bully. Obviously, there's a lot more detail to it, but it's a really interesting note, and it sort of illuminates the fact that this is sort of whatever Trump thinks it is on a given day. So it'll be interesting to see where the lines get drawn around that. And you've seen other developments, like I think the House Oversight Committee of the Democrats writing a letter to Paul Weiss saying your deal may be unlawful, we're going to look into it, which you could say is further politicization, but this is an issue is not going away. Whether it's in terms of the changes that firms feel compelled to make to their DEI policies, or setups, which is somewhat different from the executive orders. I was speaking to somebody quite well informed this morning, actually, who was drawing out a little bit of this stuff, how there is a sort of mandate the EEOC can change the terms on which policies apply and are made. That what was perfectly legal a few years ago can be reinterpreted around hiring policies, DEI, etc. And firms need to be mindful to comply with the law, and the law and regulation evolves, and whether you agree with the changes or not, under different administrations, regulators put out different advisory notes, change rules, etc. And every sector has to evolve, and that is one thing. The executive orders are quite another. But the two things do seem to have become conflated, because some firms have done deals with the administration which also make the EEOC inquiries go away too. And they do seem to be quite separate issues. So it's going to take a while to work all of this through. And I think the latest development, you've got attorney generals from 20 US states writing an open letter in support of firms fighting back against the executive orders and expressing profound disappointment. But several of the countries, larger firms have have made deals. So this the division and debate around this is not going to go away. And of course, for firms, large firms that are impacted, whether they've been targeted directly or not, many of them have made changes to DEI policies in the US. It's going to be very hard to navigate the stakeholder management and future-proofing decisions, managing the different communities where you may be making changes or rolling back on certain things, and managing not just the views among your partnership, but also your staff and your associate community is really, really important here. And, because many of them, firms don't always have specific channels for communicating with associates, and it's a group which are vitally important to communicate really well what you're doing or what you're not doing, what you're changing, what you're not changing, and why. And because if they feel left out, that's a really, really important stakeholder group as a sort of engine room of your firm. Your future partners are going to be drawn from many of them will be drawn from that group. So I think I think one of the hardest things is for firms to calibrate their engagement and their communication with associates on these issues. And I'm sure that some firms have got it more right than others, but it is inevitable that nobody's going to have got it 100% right here, because it is impossible to get it completely right. There is no completely right.
Well, I think that's the thing, because he's kind of taken away law firms' agency, hasn't he? And they don't really have that control. And what we're seeing now is the way he's controlling how they spend their pro bono time, etc., how they initiate their DEI sort of plans, are taking that away from them. And we have here another story by the lawyer which shows, I think, quite well how this is also affecting other areas such as ESG. So, for example, UK law firms have completely stormed ahead of their US counterparts. Data from the Science Based Targets Initiative shows that 29 UK firms have committed to long-term and net zero goals, and in contrast, only 14 US firms have done the same. There's so much at play here. There's the political pressure, there's the fact that Trump has completely rolled back any sort of ESG regulation, this so-called woke culture that's happening, that's all in there. But I think that we're going to see that really play out as well, and even less firms sort of committing any sort of ESG goals, etc. What are your thoughts, Michael?
The ESG sort of backlash has been around for a little while. It's not like it's a purely something that has happened since January this year. I'm not certain that. I think it's driven by the regulatory framework. I think the lawyer article says pretty strongly. It contextualizes things quite well as being driven by the regulatory framework, disclosure requirements, rules, etc. And where rules exist, of course, law firms are going to be very compliant and will go probably to the nth degree beyond other organizations to a large extent. So I think it's a good thing. I think that you're right, the division between, it's purely driven by the regulatory landscape. And law firms will do things they are required to do by law and regulation, and they will do them well. If there is no such requirement and it's purely voluntary, fewer of them will do it. And as you say, you have this backlash which has been going on for a few years against ESG in the US, which further reduces the incentives to lean into this where there isn't a set of rules that mandate it. So you're right. And one of the things that it's not that it doesn't matter, because every company, just in the same way that every individual has a carbon footprint and contributes in their own way towards climate change, every business does too. And at the same time, we have to remember that law firms are not out there running massive factories or smelting aluminium or aluminum, if you're American. The emissions from law firms, okay, there are some office buildings, there are some flights, there is, increasing use of AI, but then, then the like Microsoft and others have their own infrastructure commitments around, making sure that AI doesn't contribute too much to climate change and looking at ways to power data centers and power AI, which is, whether it's using nuclear, renewables, et cetera. So there are considerations where, law firms are becoming increasingly heavy users of AI. So that is a new consideration, I think, in terms of their own carbon footprint. However, more broadly, are not huge polluters themselves. It's important from a hygiene perspective to comply with rules, etc. But also, let's be realistic. The way that law firms can influence is really in terms of their client work. Are they helping their clients on a journey towards net zero? Equally, if a client is not interested in net zero, they're still entitled to legal advice, and they're still going to get legal advice for deals or matters of litigation, et cetera, et cetera. So it does intersect a little bit with client choices that firms make, but really it's the ability to influence clients who may be big polluters, that where law firms can have influence rather than material influence, rather than, if they can reduce the emissions from their office by 15%. Not to say that isn't important, it's just less material in the grand scheme of things.
I agree. I think that there will be clients out there that will take that into consideration if they do have any commitments towards net zero, etc. But I think you're right in terms of it's that influence. But we also have to think about sort of the next generations that will be working in these law firms. And I think for them, that is a big thing. And I think a lot of younger people will look at a law firm, and if they have no commitments whatsoever, that could potentially sway them. So I think that's definitely an element that law firms might need to consider. In terms of sort of going back to the AI piece, the Law Society Gazette has reported that corporate clients are demanding firms use AI by new research from Thomson Reuters. So they basically done a big research, a big survey here, and it said that says 59% of corporate law department respondents said they want their law firms to use AI, presumably to lower the bills, and some 8% of clients are specifying in their tender documents that law firms use AI. What do you make of this about clients actually wanting firms to use AI? I thought, I mean, it's a low percentage, don't get me wrong, but it's interesting to think that any clients would want their firms to be using AI.
I think it's understandable from a cost perspective that corporations would be wanting their advisors to be efficient. And if AI comes with efficiency gains, then they would expect to see some of those benefits. Obviously, law firms are not completely duty bound to pass that on, but the amount of, I'm not quite sure that it counts as billable to be sat there waiting for, I don't know, GPT 4.5 to do a bit of deep research for you, or whatever the tool is. So I think AI does encourage alternative pricing. It does incentivize firms to move away somewhat from straight billable hour work, where AI is going to play a significant role, because that allows them to protect margins, because they might even be able to make, the overall fee might be somewhat lower, but the margin might be extremely high, if they're able to operate AI as almost an additional team member to do a high value piece of work efficiently, instead of it taking 300 hours of time. If it takes 75 hours of time, but they've agreed a fixed fee, which which would be the equivalent of, say, 125 hours of time if they were doing it on a time basis, but actually isn't going to take anything like that amount of time, then they could actually have a higher margin, do higher margin work, but it does require them to flex and to think creatively and be commercial in terms of their pricing. Sorry, I've digressed a little bit from the actual article. Thinking aloud. Sorry. I think
No, not at all.
Obviously Thomson Reuters have invested loads of money in AI and services themselves, etc. They're not completely, they are a big player in information services for the legal sector. So they are not, they have their own interests in this.
I see. That's an interesting take.
Well, but it's. I'm not saying that it doesn't change the data. The survey is the survey, but they're not coming at this as a completely impartial observer. They are very much in this market. Yeah, and not many organisations are using a measuring return on investment as yet, but it's starting to come. Looking at employee usage, employee satisfaction, client satisfaction. There are issues around unauthorized practice by non-lawyers or the technology itself. I do think you're going to start to see jobs going from, I think we are at that tipping point now where as firms start to implement technology solutions driven by AI, as companies and firms, then certain white collar work will, I don't like the term white collar. Certain professional roles, you will need fewer roles as long as AI is being used effectively. Because it is very helpful, but it does still hallucinate certain things. I mean, I was using the AI tool we use to check to basically tidy something up really, and to put in a little bit of structure to a document yesterday, and it made up the time of the court hearing.
Oh.
And you do have to watch it like a hawk. This is not, and it was very helpful when I was reviewing the changes that it suggested to the document that we'd done. And I asked it, where did you get that from? And it didn't really have an answer. It basically hallucinated a time for a court hearing. The date we had, but the time we did not have, and it made it up. And that sort of thing is quite alarming. So you have to be I'm sort of getting into the flow of using it for certain things, but it is not fire and forget. It is not going to do the work for you. It really isn't. It can do the work with you. It can supplement the work. It can improve the work. But God, you've got to watch it.
I completely agree.
Because it will make stuff up.
Exactly, and it can also be quite obvious, I think, when it has been used in certain situations, and you've got to be really careful, and you've still got to have your own twist on it and edit it. I think it's good for giving you the right sort of path, but it's unreliable. And speaking about things not being reliable, we had a bit of a crisis in Iberia, didn't we, this week? A new office for Jariguez had just opened on Monday in Madrid. So you just sat down in your new office and there is a massive power cut. That's not great, is it, Michael?
Well, I think it's just obviously, I mean, no, I think the whole of the Iberian Peninsula had this like unprecedented kind of breakdown of their energy grid for what, nobody seems to be entirely clear on what happened, but it might be electrification of everything comes with its own risks, and they've got a lot of renewable power and a lot of electrification, but if you don't have a diverse range of supplies going into your grid, so I think somebody was calling it as potentially like a green out, where almost it was out of balance because there wasn't enough generation coming from gas, etc., and too much from renewables, and it all got out of balance and just completely collapsed. Which I don't know if that is what happened, but quite remarkable development if that is the case. But anyway, coming back to, it was we saw the story, Garrigues with like literally first day in their new corporate HQ, and boom, over lunch everything goes down. Obviously nationwide, but you can imagine as an employer, as a law firm, management, you'd like, yeah, everybody, we're in the new office, great, everybody enjoy facilities, isn't it great to be here? And then, oh, right, can everybody go home, please? It's the sort of thing that you do not expect to happen, but it's a good reminder that having business continuity plans in place, which includes communications dimensions and includes the fact that you will get asked by media if something impacts your building, your country, your location in a way on a scale like this, because legal press are always interested in, are you still able to operate, what's happened, they'll always find an angle. And also your kind of internal communications, and you've got to have ways to communicate even when everything goes down. And it was just a good reminder that the most remarkable things can just come out of nowhere, and business life is always finds a way to give you curveballs. And every COO, every law firm managing partner in Spain on this week would have been, right, how do we deal with this? And yes, it's temporary. Yes, there are plenty of businesses like the train, companies which had bigger problems to deal with, etc. But it's a good reminder to make sure that your business continuity plans are in place, up to date, and to give them a refresh if you haven't looked over them recently.
Yes, and to always have autosave on your documents, because that would be also an absolute nightmare if you were halfway through a big document and your computer just completely went down. That would be a nightmare. So a lot of lessons to come out of that there. But yes, it all seems to be fine now. All's back to normal, and no major casualties. So, but yeah. So I think that's all the topics that we have for today. If you've made it to the end, thank you very much. And thank you to Michael for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
And yes, we'll see you soon. We'll see you next week.
You've been listening to Counsel Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and join us again next week, where we'll be discussing some more of the biggest stories in the legal sector.